Welcome to Azriel Code Lab. In this video we will learn about stored procedures. If you have basic knowledge of SQL Server you can easily learn about stored procedures. So let's get started. What is a stored procedure and why do we need them? So a stored procedure is a group of one or more database statements stored in the database's data dictionary. Stored procedures can be called from TSQL using an execute command. They can be called from a program outside the database server such as a web server or client program. So again, think of a stored procedure as a collection of statements that have been stored on the database. And when you call that one object or collection of statements, all the statements in that body will execute. So the first thing I want to point out is that each stored procedure has a name. So here we have the stored procedure called USP find employee. So from the name you can imagine what this stored procedure is going to do, which is to find an employee in our database. This procedure accepts a parameter that allows us to receive an input and then use that input later on in the stored procedure to do something. So we are going to be taking the business entity ID, which is a primary key from the human resources employee table. We'll be using that to look up employees. So here we have now the stored procedure name, and the parameter. The items in green here are the items that get executed by the stored procedure. So we have a couple of statements that are being run. Set no count on tells the database to not report how many rows are brought back in the query. It's for efficiency purposes. The select statement that's going into our human resources employee table, and selecting a business entity ID, where the business entity ID is equal to this value here, which happens to be the parameter that was passed in. We will talk about the mechanics of parameters later on. But just for now, assume that if a value of 50 was brought into this parameter, that we would be running a select statement where business entity ID equals 50. When this select statement runs, then the result set is returned. So whatever causes stored procedure, we'll get back a result set of rows of what was found from the slot. So in this case it will be a single row of the same employee with their entity ID, their ID number, login, job title and hire date. In summary, the stored procedure has a name. There's inputs to stored procedure. There is the execution of the stored procedure, and then ultimately there are results that are output from the stored procedure. Why do we need stored procedures? One reason is for maintainability. Stored procedures provide one location to keep tricky code. So instead of having to replicate a series of program steps or database code, and several locations within your database, you can put them in one place within the stored procedure, and then just call that code from one location, which encourages modular programming. And as you can imagine, centralized code is easier to troubleshoot, and it's much easier than to chase down bugs and rectify them within your database. Another reason to use stored procedures is to encapsulate business logic. We can keep rules consistent between calling programs, such as programs that are calling our database from either Excel or C# or Power BI. They can call a stored procedure, and get the same consistent results as opposed to using a query that they may have constructed on their own. Also, stored procedures provide stronger security. They can also control what code a user can see. So if you have sensitive queries, you can avoid having users actually see the query code that is run. They can only call a stored procedure, but they can't actually see what's the logic that makes up the stored procedure. So that it gives you control over that, as well as you also have control over who can actually execute a stored procedure. And then lastly, stored procedures also bring with them some efficiencies with the logic things on the server. So as opposed to having to send multiple commands from a client to a database, we can send one command to say execute a stored procedure, which can well execute our multiple commands. In addition, stored procedures are cached on the database server. So once they are run, they are ready to run again. Now you should have an appreciation for what a stored procedure is and why we need them. So see you in the next lesson.